Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. I'm just going to put these on. A very warm welcome to our audience here and to our panel for coming and joining us for what will be fascinating and a really timely discussion on building tomorrow's city, a sustainable heaven for nature and humanity. Thank you all for joining. Together, we'll explore how new partnerships and funding are needed to help cities thrive for their communities and nature, and some examples of this. So I know this is going to be a very dynamic discussion and hopefully Q&A as well. A quick introduction from myself. I'm Maya Kuttner, the Global Director of Cities, States and Regions at CDP. CDP is the global not-for-profit that runs the world's environmental disclosure system for companies, cities, states, and regions. My team works with over 1,000 cities on their climate reporting and management. And I'm delighted to be joined here by our panel. I'll let them introduce themselves. I'll start with Sarah first. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Sarah Merrick, founder and CEO of Ripple. Ripple enables everyone here potentially, to own little bits of large wind farms and solar parks and then get the green low-cost power that they generate supplied to their home via the grid. So we've got 2 projects operational, another one is about to start construction, and one is open literally today. So great.
Over to you, Christopher.
Good morning still, everybody. My name is Chris Hammond. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of UK 100. We are a coalition of 113 councils and political leaders across the country from both urban and rural authorities, all political parties represented, coming together to accelerate the local net zero transition. We think that local leaders have such a crucial role to play, which is why we exist, to give them the powers and resources needed to achieve that.
Thank you, Chris. Over to Amy.
Yes, good morning everyone. My name is Amy Jones and I'm the Director for Environment at Westminster City Council. So within my portfolio I have responsibility for the Climate Emergency Programme, air pollution, dealing with the ecological emergency and the Waste and Cleansing Service. And we working within Westminster is a hugely challenging environment. We have some of the worst air pollution levels and some of the highest greenhouse gas emissions for the country. So a hugely challenging but exciting role.
Thank you, Amy. And over to Alan, who joined us today from Canada.
Thank you. I'm Alain Olivier Desbois. I'm Chief Finance and Impact Officer at Onika Technology. At Onika, we're trying to address the water scarcity issue. As a technology company, our mission is to make the ocean a sustainable and affordable source of fresh water. So this is a big problem. We have operations in the United States and also in Chile. As you can understand, Canada is blessed with water, so we have to go elsewhere. But it's the water scarcity is a big problem, and we try to help cities to reshape or redesign their future, addressing water scarcity and thrive and well-being with water access.
Thank you so much. Let's get started. The first question I wanted to ask is for Chris. So Chris, why should cities, and in the UK context, let's say local authorities, be thinking of nature? Why is this so important and different from just containing climate action or adaptation mitigation?
Well, in this country and across the world, we've got an ecological crisis. And one of our reports showed that England has some of the most nature-deprived areas in the world, which surprised us. It's one of these issues where nature is something that's usually seen as something that's managed, something that needs to be controlled. We tarmac over our cities, we concrete our buildings. And what that has done is that has had a huge impact on our ecosystems. And what we've always done is measured our land space in its price points, but never the social value. And the social value of our nature and our green spaces is so important for our health as a species. There's lots of research about the mental impacts of green spaces on people and access to the sea and our lakes and our bathing areas. But it's a crucial point that, as well as that journey to net zero and tackling greenhouse gas emissions, that we put as much effort into revitalizing our green spaces, our peatlands, our forests, and all the range of different kind of green spaces we've got across the country. So lots of councils are doing kind of nature-based recovery plans, which are really important, as well as their kind of climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. So it is a really important issue. It goes beyond just building, the built environment. It's also about that social aspect and that social dividend that we get from nature.
Great. So let's hear from Amy from the perspective of a council. So in terms of the big picture, what should local authorities be doing in the long run to see both people and nature thrive within their boundaries?
Thanks. I mean, I think one of the most important things that we can do is to stop seeing these big, complicated, systemic issues in isolation. So we're talking about the interconnectedness of health, poverty, well-being, climate, air pollution, green space and nature. All of these things intersect with one another, and we see that on our doorstep across our city. So, for example, we recently developed a tool called an environmental justice measure to look at the overlay between environmental factors and inequality across the city, and using an index of multiple deprivation, which very clearly showed the clear relationship between those areas of the borough that had poor health outcomes for our communities, as well as kind of a relationship between low income, poor health outcomes and poor environmental conditions in terms of high exposure to air pollution, heat risk, and poor access to green space. And we know some of the most deprived areas of our community, where the communities are the most diverse, there are higher incidences of anxiety and least access to green space. And those are really clear correlations. So we need to kind of take a really holistic approach to the way that we respond to those challenges. I think the other really important issue is collaboration. In terms of the emissions for Westminster as a whole, the council contributes about 2%. So if we are going to resolve this challenge, we need to work in partnership. And we have a broad spectrum of stakeholders in the city, from 53,000 businesses to 25 million visitors through the year and 200,000 diverse communities. So that's a really tough nut to crack in terms of how do we reach out to them. And I think what we need to do is make it meaningful and stop talking about adaptation, mitigation, net zero. How do we embed this into things that people really care about? And the final thing that I'll say is, with collaboration, we need to think about ourselves in that leadership role as an authority. We have authority to act. We don't necessarily have the power. We don't have the power to mandate action, and nor should we. So we need to rely on strong influencing, convening and partnership and building relationships. And I think in terms of our communities, we need to think about how do we give them the resources, the information and the capacity to act. Who are they influenced by? Where is that power of influence? That's not necessarily with us. That could be with the voluntary sector, and it could be with community voices. So I think we have to absolutely look big picture, have holistic approaches, and think about our role as leaders in that space.
Thank you, Amy. So to follow up on that, so what are the biggest challenges facing local authorities in achieving this outcome, if we look at the outcome being thriving environment, thriving communities alongside each other?
I mean, I think there's many challenges in that, but I think the most obvious one is investment and funding, which you would expect. Across Westminster, 86% of our emissions come from the built environment. That's combustion to heat and power our buildings across the entire city. So decarbonising our energy system is going to be key to delivering net zero by 2040, the commitment that we've made for the borough. And we just recently commissioned a study looking at how we achieve that through a local area energy planning report, and what that's telling us is that we need an eye-watering £5.1 billion worth of investment to get there. That's 60% of that will be about improving the leakiness of the historic buildings across our landscape. We know that about 62% of properties across the city have an EPC rating of D or below. That's a huge challenge. But another big challenge is getting off gas, looking at air source heat pump solutions, looking at communal district heat network solutions. And we know that big green infrastructure is going to come at quite significant cost, particularly in a densely built environment like ours, where 80% is covered by a conservation status, which makes it even more challenging. So we need to find ways of leveraging that investment into those big projects and help us progress our energy decarbonisation.
Brilliant, thank you, Amy. So we heard from Chris, who works with local authorities all over the UK. We heard from Amy representing her council and working hard on the ground. Let's now focus on the technology a little bit. So we've got Sarah and Ellen here, both of them championing very different technologies. So so let's hear about that a little bit. So Sarah and then Alan, maybe, how important is having scalable solutions to these challenges that we talked about? So are smaller projects viable, or do they not have an impact? If you could just talk to that point about the scalability of the solutions.
Yes, I think if we're going to get, really big impact, you need to be having big projects. So, the projects that we work on are like, our latest one is 60 megawatts, and the amount of effort that can go into getting a smaller project off the ground, can be not that dissimilar to one that might be, 100 times the size. So, we've got to be getting like as big a bang for our buck as we can possibly get. It's very expensive. And so if we are going to be, meeting the net zero challenge, we have to be doing it as cheaply as possible with the lowest cost options as possible. So yeah, Ripple is all about enabling people, housing, local authorities, companies to come together and collectively own large-scale projects, because with energy, scale is so important. Big projects are simply way, way cheaper than smaller scale projects. But also, take London, there isn't, or almost other cities, there isn't the kind of renewable resource within a city to meet their net zero commitments or ambitions. So it's really important that we can, start looking beyond the kind of city walls and find ways that you can get people in the city, local authorities within cities, to be able to access projects, not necessarily on their doorstep, but getting the green power in via the grid.
Thank you, Sarah. And Alan, what about you? What about your technology?
Yeah, no, I think it's important to mention it, and thanks, Sarah, because it's with scalability comes the reality of scaling technologies, and it takes time. It takes time. Technologies, clean technology takes 5 to 10 years to get from the lab to demonstrations, projects, to eventually being able to scale these. And that's the reality of being able to combine forces. I've been a venture capitalist for 25 years. I just joined this company called Onika Technologies. And the reality, this founders started this business, 10 years ago with this idea of trying to address water scarcity. But the reality is that you got to combine forces. You need to have, the right team. You need to be able to have the funding to demonstrate this. So the scalability comes with a lot of involvements with a lot of stakeholders that along that route of being able to scale your solution in the marketplace. You have to address these elements, and the product market fit and the timing of the market. In our case, water scarcity, 5 years ago, I was talking to the Kenyan governments about water, and no responses. There was not even on the radar, even though people are pumping water from our ground and selling it back to the world. And now it's becoming more a reality. They put up programs like the Ocean Supercluster in place, to bring, valuable programs that can finance the demonstration phase. We got Sustainable Technology of Canada. So this is a reality of being able to combine forces and then collaborations and then authorities that brings permitting, facilitating the adoptions of these new technologies before the big founders, the pension fund and the banks can really finance these projects. 20 years ago, the wind farm industry, was not what it is today. So the wave energy power desalination is just at the infancy. So there's benchmarks that exist. Just try to replicate this and try to help scale more rapidly.
Thank you, Ellen. That's great. Let's try to bring these ideas to life a little bit and back to the city level. So I'm going to ask Amy again, and then if any of you have anything to add about specific examples. Do you have an example of an innovative program or approach that worked and yielded significant benefits for both nature and communities?
Many, I'm pleased to say, but one that we're particularly proud of, which has picked up a few awards, I will note, was the investment that we've put into electrification of our waste and cleansing fleet. So to give you a sense of scale, the waste collection vehicles in Westminster City pick up waste 50 million times a year. And imagine that kind of large fleet of vehicles, very heavy diesel power vehicles through the city, creating noise, creating air pollution and emissions associated with it. So what we've done is invested £20 million into first stage of electrification of our large waste collection fleet. We have invested in developing infrastructure at a site called Landman Way near Bermondsey, if you know London, which we've then been able to kind of run a cable effectively into the southeast London combined heat and power plant. So this is an energy from waste facility. So effectively, Westminster's waste is transported in electric vehicles that are charged from the electricity that is produced from the incineration of Westminster's waste, creating a whole kind of closed loop system. And I think something like 89% improvement in emissions for the electric vehicles compared to diesel, and of course the air pollution saving that comes with that. So that's something that we're hugely proud of. We're not stopping there. We've got another 40 vehicles that we're looking to electrify in the coming year, and that's on top of 100 cleansing vehicles as well. So we're really committed in terms of walking the walk on achieving net zero, on electrification, and finding new and innovative solutions to deliver that.
Is there any other examples that people would like to? Maybe Chris, over to you. We haven't heard from you.
Yeah, well, there's so much innovation in local government, and it covers so many different areas. We heard some of them just now, but a couple that I'll just draw attention to. West Berkshire did a sort of community green bond, so they raised funds from the public, and that was then reinvested in nature-based solutions across the area. Really successful fund. Greater Manchester had an environment fund, which did a similar thing, reinvesting these grants out, giving the powers and the money back to communities to kind of really shape those local areas. You're seeing a lot of kind of like micro interventions for nature, like putting kind of grass, wild grass verges, now seeds for insects. There's lots of kind of bee parks in kind of parks across the country. On bus stops, there's lots of kind of wildflower type, meadow type things that are being put forward. We're reintroducing species back into the wild. So beavers have made a comeback. So in lots of different areas across the country, councils will work with different partners like wildlife trusts to reintroduce species back in. So there's lots of really nice nature kind of interventions that are happening across the country, as well as some of those big kind of changes you'd want to see in your heating systems and your transport networks. There's a real push for nature.
Great. So that leads us to Sarah.
Yeah. So we have more of a sort of commercial example, but Bruntwood is a property company in Manchester. So they own most of Oxford Road in Manchester. They bought basically a £10 million share in our latest wind farm, and so then most of their electricity will be coming from the wind farm. It's just started operating a few weeks ago, but it just shows that, you know, whatever the equivalent is, probably about 8 megawatts. You know, for them to do 8 megawatts of solar on the roofs of their properties would be a real stretch. It's a lot easier for them to just in one foul swoop be able to say, look, we've bought a bit of a wind farm, we're getting all of our power from that wind farm, and it can just be done so easily with a huge impact. So there's a lot of, you know, I think it's a lot of it is about marrying up kind of, you know, local projects with local impacts with, you know, bigger projects that can just deliver huge impacts, right across the country.
So I'd like to have one example. I think it's from the other side of the world, which we have one client we're working with called the City of Fort Bragg in California. So when you're lacking water, you're just realizing how important water is for your like community. And it was the fact for the City of Fort Bragg. They had to truck water from 80 miles, costing them $1 million per month for 8,000 of population. So just realizing that the reality is, so they came up with that strategy of trying to reinvent their community, leveraging on the blue economy strategies, looking at how they can use the nature, which is just, they were facing nature, oceans, how they can bring aquaculture into the mix, how they can de-risk the water scarcity issue and shift that as a way to create value for their own community. So this is something that we're now dealing with this, but this is not only one community. This is the reality of many communities out there that are facing water scarcity and trying to shift how nature can service them and can put back some of the new businesses, ecotourisms, and eventually how you can empower your people to look at revitalize your community using technology, but also projects.
Yes, Amy.
Yeah, I just wanted to also reflect on the need for innovation in the space of collaboration as opposed to sort of just looking at particular projects. And I suppose that's something that we're challenging ourselves quite hard on. And I think in terms of your question earlier about kind of piloting and scaling up pilots, what we're looking at is picking up my earlier point about where there's that intersection between health outcomes, poverty, discrimination, injustice and climate. For example, we've got a really targeted programme of activity in North Paddington area of Westminster at the moment, where there is a real vulnerability because we have an 18-year life expectancy gap across the borough, and this is where communities are really exposed to the hardest condition. So that's where we're looking at having a much more co-production and co-design approach to working with our communities, bringing them into the decision-making process and supporting them to do that. We are actually funding voluntary sector representatives as an extension of our team, so that real kind of true delivery in partnership and thinking about how our efforts to tackle crime, education, health, employment and climate all comes together in ways which are really meaningful for people and their lived experiences. And that's really exciting for us. And some of the specifics around the kind of nature-based work we're looking at doing there are around how we use greening to improve the flood resilience of some of our most deprived council estates. What does greener living mean for our communities? Let's help them to identify that for themselves. Are there kind of circular economy projects that we can help facilitate there, and providing opportunities for them to own their own green space, create local nature reserves, because one of the key values of that, which as you mentioned earlier, is community cohesion, overcoming cultural barriers, dealing with issues like loneliness and social isolation, and particularly well-being. So that's really exciting work for us, and something we're really keen to really make a success.
Thank you. So we talked about solutions in the area of nature, and now, Sarah, if we focus on emissions reductions and decarbonization specifically, what is the situation within the UK? So we know that many local authorities have net zero targets. Are they on track? What are the biggest challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, I think we saw, a few years ago, a big wave of councils, declaring climate emergencies. But I think the impact or the kind of action that's come off the back of that has probably been a bit less dramatic than the, declarations themselves. So I think what we're looking at, and particularly, should Labour win the next election, they are looking to really actively work with local authorities, with co-ops and with, the private sector as well, to enable really, really significant, decarbonisation projects to happen. I think there's £600 million that's been kind of earmarked. So, we're really, really excited about the potential shift in approach that you may get come the 5th of July. So yeah, and I think it's that kind of, unlocking and unleashing all of this kind. The local authorities want to act, but it's been really difficult. Really limited amounts of funds that they've had to work with, and so if you can get local authorities working alongside cooperatives to deliver, amazing new renewable energy projects, it would decarbonise local authorities. Obviously, it decentralises and democratises ownership as well. So there's just so many things that can happen. So we are really, really excited for the potential shift that we can get in approach should Labour win the next election.
Thank you. Amy, I think wants to...
I just wanted to come in on that as somebody who has the lived experience of being brought in to respond to a climate emergency declaration and then have the challenge of working out, okay, so what does that actually mean and how do we respond? It is hugely challenging. the ambition is there, but there is no blueprint for how to do this as a local authority, and you can see some of the work that we've been doing with London councils and the reviews that they've done kind of looking across local authorities across London show that we're all kind of operating in the same space with the same kinds of actions and activities where there's huge opportunity for joining up, actually, avoiding issues where we're kind of all pulling on the same supply chains, or we're all competing for the proliferation of funding pots from government which are confusing to apply for and have unrealistic expectations around delivery. That is a huge challenge, but so is kind of building the capability and the capacity as teams. And I'd say my final point is then, having gone through that journey, where we are now is thinking about how do we embed this into everything that the council does so we can leverage the full opportunity of the networks and connections that a council has with that broad range of stakeholders I mentioned. And that is the kind of the biggest challenge that we have now. And I think that's about making this meaningful for everyone and not just kind of in that environmental or nature space.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, just one quick point, one good example. I think it's you need to have cohesions among all the levels of governments. When you want to move an industry like desalination, you need to have these cohesions of regulations, laws, and improvements, and the carrots and the stick, to be able to move the needle. And I think it's quite important. That people come together and give clear indication to the industry. So decarbonizing the desalination industry, which is, if you project that industry the way it is today with conventional desal turning fuel into water, it's going to be it's going to emit twice the amount of the aviation industry in 2050. So this is not the way to go. So you need that cohesion on all the levels, municipalities, local governments, but also the national governments.
Thank you. Chris, what's your view on this?
So the climate emergencies was a good political moment. So campaigners lobbying their local leaders, their local administrations to declare a climate emergency and set a target and get a plan behind it. Without the targets, there probably wouldn't have been the wholesale amount of plans that there are now, and there wouldn't be the action that's going on in the sector. So it was an effective change catalyst. But now it's the boring bit, quite frankly. It's the delivery. And that's going to be tricky. And that's going to require trade-offs, and that's going to require us to be apprised of some really big changes in the sector. So I do this job full-time, and I'm always meeting new people and hearing about new technology. Now, if you're trying to deliver all the services that you deliver, a council that I was an elected leader of had over 700 different services. We were focused on the day job, trying to put out the current fire of the political fire of the day, and then also trying to do a 20, 30-year time horizon for the city that we were in. So leaders and politicians don't have a lot of bandwidth to be apprised of all these different things and the interconnectedness and the trade-offs and trying to get that money. So we need to simplify the system as best we can. We can do that by looking at funding, and I'm pleased that most of the political parties have now recognized this. We are far too centralized in this country. Too much power sits with Westminster and Whitehall. And the funding system, we've said, is a bit like a Hunger Games style competition where councils are parading their projects to officials to try and get that money. And we're having to compete against each other. So does it matter if the money goes to Westminster or if it goes to Warrington? We need to decarbonise everywhere, and we need to kind of do it in a sensible, pragmatic way so that we can bring those communities with us and make those interventions have a long legacy. So yes, the climate emergency, great, but it's all of the work that sits underneath it. This is going to be the difficult thing. And trying to not do it, and as we just heard, the costs of not zero, not working towards this, we can't afford it. It's too high. The impacts we're starting to see, and we're starting to quantify them. If you think about how the government had to subsidise all of our energy bills last year in the cost of around 40 to 60 billion pounds, we can't afford to do that as a country. So we need to then build the smart energy systems of tomorrow, today. We need to get moving on that, and we need to think about who then benefits from this transition. Because there will be money, there will be opportunities. Is it all sucked up in one direction, or is this an opportunity to look at innovative new ways of building a more fairer and just society?
Thanks, Chris. I'd love to focus on this topic of financing and funding the transition. But before we do that, Sarah, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, so I think it's just to say that with big projects, they can potentially work across with a number of different local authorities. So you could have 4, 5, 6 local authorities collectively owning, alongside a co-op, a large wind farm. But also our very first wind farm, it's a single turbine in Wales, that received a £1 million grant from the Welsh Government, and so that's about a quarter of the project value. Instead of the Welsh Government getting cheaper electricity, all the money that would have gone into bill savings has gone into fuel poverty. So there's been about £600,000 in the last 3 years that's set to go into fuel poverty. So people in fuel crisis can then get fuel crisis loans to get their electricity put back on like that afternoon. So it just shows that you can have solutions where you've got the decarbonisation impact by owning a quarter of a wind farm. It's obviously generating loads and loads of low-cost green power, but it can also feed through into other social benefits. In the case of Greg Rather, our pilot project, being able to help thousands of people get cheaper electricity directly who they haven't got any involvement with the wind farm, but it can help support people in the region.
Perfect. So focusing on this area of finance and funding, it's not surprising that all our panelists pretty much brought that up, which is not unusual when we talk about this topic with local authorities. So finance and funding is often cited as the most significant barrier an enabler to local authorities taking actions on climate and nature. So I'd like to focus a little bit on the role of private capital here. So perhaps from Alan. Alan, how can private capital synergize with local and regional authorities to yield optimal outcomes for communities? Do you have any powerful examples from your work?
Yes, totally. I can give you an example. And I think that's the important piece of the equation. And that's been my journey about how to transform finance in a way that you can align interests between all the stakeholders. And this is why I joined this company, because the promise of using technology is one thing. So you got a promising technology. Now you need to have an innovative business model that attract a lot of capital. In our case, what we've done is basically looking at this hard technology and transform this into a water sales, kind of approach. So creating recurring revenue for the investors, and that's what they're looking for actually. How you scale a business and then to do this. So we took our technology, and instead of just selling our technology, we're basically building projects. And then this is better. It is a better way to align interests with the community. When you're deploying these projects, then you can use, and in our case, beyond just selling water and resolving the problem of conventional desalination, which is energy intensive, which is polluting and all this is all we're resolving. But beyond providing water to these communities, because of our solution is in the ocean, we can enable a lot of other co-benefits. And this is where the magics of eventually using, design instruments like impact bonds, or eventually other instruments that combine carbon credits, biodiversity credits. If you're able to regenerate oceans, protect oceans, and eventually use your technology to enable other innovators to come to your journey and enhance the projects, then you're shifting the discussions with the investors, and then you build capacity, and then you're able to use not only blended capital approach, combining grants and programs, but also concessory capital, but also private equity investors, because you are able to bring them, as you've been de-risking the projects with these type of investors, and then they can have their returns and join the forces in combining, a blended capital approach to finance these huge projects that needs a lot of capital when you're deploying desalination plants or new renewable energy plants. This is amount of capital that is necessary. But if you're able to use finance as a way to align interests with all these parties, then you're basically fast in the process to scale these solutions in the marketplace.
Thanks, Alan. Amy, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the issue from how we see it in Westminster, and I mentioned earlier that kind of the huge investment requirement for us to decarbonise our energy system. So we absolutely have to leverage private investment if we're going to get anywhere in terms of delivering that. And I think this is an area where local authorities are not kind of well versed. I don't I wouldn't know how to go about commercialising a large green infrastructure project myself. We'd have to bring that expertise in. So I think this is an area where we could really do with some support. I know that there are initiatives out there. There's 3CI, for example, who are working hard to bring together the private sector with local authorities, and that's something that we're quite actively involved in. But I think this is a really important area where we need to kind of see these worlds come together and understand what our respective requirements and priorities are, thinking very simplistically in terms of commercial investment needing to see kind of certain rates of return over given time horizons. These are very complicated, tricky projects requiring lots of disruption within cities and, merging into issues where the council will have quite considerable concerns around community needs and benefits. Where are we prioritising that investment? Who wins? Who loses? Are we exacerbating the cost of living pressures, or are we improving them? And what's the balance between protecting the impacts on our residents and the consumers versus the returns that investors may need to see to make the projects viable? So I think this is a really interesting area. It's getting to the nub of the issue for us as we kind of look ahead on our net zero 2040 journey, and an area where I think we really need to kind of think about that capacity building.
Thanks, Amy. And Chris, maybe over to you, because we talked here about the need for the public sector and the private sector to work together to find financing solutions, but perhaps gaps that exist in capacity, skills, understanding, speaking the same language, which leads very much to this topic of collaboration, which, Amy, you spoke about too. Collaboration is about bridging those gaps, perhaps. So what, in your opinion, in your experience working in the UK, how important is it to enable those collaborations?
Well, it's absolutely vital, because if we don't have the kind of collaborations, there's no way that we can kind of leverage in the intelligence and the kind of the technology and the kind of the models that, we've got two other people on the panel here have got really good, exciting ideas, exciting things that local authorities will be interested in. Local authorities are the only people in their place who will be that absolute advocate and that placemaker. And they need to leverage in those partnerships to make that happen. So councils don't have the biggest carbon footprint in their areas, probably quite low down. I always used to laugh that students would come and protest outside of City Hall when actually they marched from the university, which had a carbon footprint that was 3 times higher than ours was as a council. So I'd tell them to turn around and go and do it outside the Vice Chancellor's office. But there is this absolute need for local authorities to be those conveners of place and to bring in those partnerships, because that's how we can kind of do it in a way that is going to be cost effective. We need to also then give the private sector something. So we need the private sector to be honest about what their benefits are, what they're going to get out of the partnership. We need to move quickly. The governance structures between the two organisations don't always marry up quite nicely, so you get frustrations, but by either side. And then there is that kind of that win-win-win model, which is a win for both organisations, and then that societal win, which is also useful to be quantified of those partnerships. So those leaders of place roles are really important for local authorities. But I think councils have been burnt in the past by different kind of long-term corporate partnerships. You've seen it in kind of the wave of outsourcing of council services. Some were effective, some were disastrous. You see it with things like PFI, where there was those long-term kind of financial instruments to build schools and hospitals and everything else, which weren't always good value for the taxpayer. So it is this kind of, these overlapping circles of what's good value, what's delivering societal benefit, what's a win-win-win for all the two organisations and the society as a whole. And at the moment, we don't have kind of the structures and the partnerships on a kind of a big scaled model to make that happen. So we do need, I think, to leverage in those different kind of aspects to it. The Bristol City Leap project is a really good example of that long-term pipeline. The private sector need certainty and they need clarity. So they need certainty and clarity to bring their multi-year investment horizons alongside local authorities. And whilst you still have that funding cycle where it's 1 yearly budgets for councils, that's really hard to then convince the two people on the stage here to then give a 10-year kind of investment in an area.
But the clarity will come with the major gap, which is data. So if you're looking at impact investing, and this is the promise of impact investing, is basically having an intention to make an impact, but force yourself to measure these impact metrics. So forcing yourself to have a baseline, and from that baseline, how you can transfer that. But that will be the collective way of looking at how are we doing, and how can we do to move the needle from the baseline to better outcomes. And that this is where system change and impact investing will deliver the promises and basically help the city's councillors and everyone to put up the right programs and the right incentives to move the needle. And so, but the data gaps that we're experiencing, which is everyone is trying to figure it out, it comes with innovators like us, to put up together the impact metrics, impact measurement, and methodologies, to move the needle based on life cycle assessments and based on these measurable, tangible, scientific-based elements to move the needle.
Thank you.
I think that's right. I think we need to break open in the public service our data sets and put them out there, and we need to kind of open source, collaborate on the solutions. I think that's a really kind of important part of the journey. Of course, you need to put safeguards in place. Of course, you can put people's personal data out there. But actually, if you think about health, if you think about the kind of information that councils have, that's such a rich kind of vault of information that could be used to really help us address our problems.
Thank you. So I'd like the audience now to start thinking about really good questions. Difficult questions are fine too. Before I go back to our panelists with a final question, a brief one, which is, what is the one thing you would like the audience to remember and take away from today's discussion? So maybe starting you with Sarah and going through, and then we'll open up for questions.
I think that we can do massive, really, really fantastic things if we come together. So whether that's local authorities coming together with communities, with co-ops, with the private sector, that collaboration can deliver amazing results with multiple levels of impact, whether that's lower bills for everyone, green impact, and building communities. But we need to be working together.
I would say that local government is probably one of the most ambitious parts of the public sector in the net zero journey. And the local transition can be delivered cheaper, faster and better if we give more powers and financing to councils rather than keeping it in Westminster and Whitehall.
I agree. I won't say collaboration. What I would like you to think about is the point I made earlier about looking at this holistically through integrated solutions, because I think we have to get over the message about why people should care and therefore act on this agenda, and that is about making it meaningful for them, and that's about people, as opposed to just looking narrowly at this as an environmental issue. We talked about health outcomes, we looked at, there's opportunities for employment, skills, there's loads of ways in which all of these things intersect, and we need to keep that in focus.
Yeah, no, totally echoing what you just said. I think collaborations, and we're at the inflection point, that everything comes together right now. So with all these tools, capital and new ways of looking at this and the systemic approach, and people convening, so not working in silos. And this is even private companies like ours and startups, this is where we want to go. So we understand that we're not going to be the only one able to resolve the water scarcity issue if we don't combine forces with other innovators and being able to fasten the process and scale it. We're not going to succeed to move the needle fast enough, to prevent the crisis we're entering into. So this is urgent that we act or design our society differently and use innovations, but also in social innovations as well to change behaviors of people.
Perfect. On this great note, I'd like to thank everyone, and we'll move to the questions from the audience now. So how many people have questions? Just so we probably have time for about 3. So we've got 1, 2, 3. Can I suggest that maybe we take them together? We hear from all 3, and then we kind of answer it. I think that, we've got 10 minutes, so I think we could do that. Hear from all 3, and then we'll answer.
Yeah, I have a question especially for Amy, because I think our 3 heads that are quite related to the work of council. I'm on the Residents Association of one of the Westminster residencies. Our business is quite active in logistics in Westminster as well, and then I'm advising a startup that's really trying to get in touch with Westminster for one of the programs. What would be your advice to reach out to councils from these kinds of businesses, startups, and I guess like engaged residents, how to get in touch and bring the innovations, like how to meet in the middle, because you guys are driving a lot of initiatives. Others have ideas. How can we bridge the gap of just getting to the right people?
Yeah, it's a good... we're not answering yet, are we? Too keen.
Hi, I've got a question. It's kind of for everyone or anyone who'd like to answer. It's about risk. So when you're implementing innovation to solve some of these problems that we have, where should the risk sit? It currently, I think, mostly sits with the private sector. But actually, is there a way that some of the councils could take on some of the risk that would help to implement innovative solutions?
Hello, everybody. My name is Agnes Weiss, and I'm coming from the BMW Group. And we do some public-private partnership in the area of transition for mobility for cities. And I have a simple question, but it might have a complex answer. So what I see is that it's not very easy to go into these public-private partnerships because we are talking about so different cultures. We are talking about a city council that has a completely different culture than a business, a company. So my question is, how can we facilitate these partnerships better? Who should facilitate them? Who should initiate them? How could we make it much more than what exists? For example, in the automotive sector, we don't know of many in the area of sustainable mobility. So what is, in your opinion, how could we facilitate it better?
Yeah, I'll just come to the first question. I mean, I think, put my hands up and say, I think local authorities are notoriously difficult to understand how to get into the right person. I mean, as simple as things like our organogram is often out of date and it causes me frustration, so let alone anyone else that's trying to work out who's the best person to talk to. So I think we have a job to do to make ourselves much more accessible. It is something that as Westminster we are really trying to think hard about in terms of the interface with us, how we are reaching out into the community, how we are bringing in and supporting innovation that's out there. It sounds like there's some great ideas that you're referencing. So I don't have a direct answer for you, but happy to have a chat afterwards, but I definitely see that as a challenge, and I think we need to find mechanisms to be much more outward facing and have clearer ins to the council to support that kind of partnership working that we really need on this agenda.
Fantastic, thank you, Amy. So I think we can roll the two questions into one, perhaps, about the different cultures, working with local authorities and the private sector. Those innovations are important, but how do we make that work? How do we bridge that gap? And then linking to that question around risk-taking and whether more of that can sit with the local authority. Alan, do you want to give it a try?
Yeah, I'm going to give you an example from our perspective. So we think it has to be grassroots. So it has to come from the community. So this is for us to develop a project with cities. Even it's our client. We sell water to them. There's no way we can ignore the other stakeholders and the fishermen communities and the people that relates to the environmental aspect of their land and such. So this is, I think today the social acceptance is so critical that you need to start from there. It has to come from a problem. You need to consult. You need to engage them, and then we're trying to figure it out on our part. How can we innovate on the social elements? How can we bring all these people together in a system change approach and redesign and get them, empower them to be involved in the process? And I think we're going to go much faster and further if we do that than just trying to get that from private, to consult, to all this. At the end of the day, councils are moving, are shifting, and so who stays is the people in the community who really cares about what's going on and how they want to reshape the future.
Amy?
Yeah, I think just picking up the point about risk, I think if you reflect on the scale of the challenge that we have around things like the climate emergency, we are going to have to take risks because we're going to need to be bold. I think there is a way in which we can constrain or manage that risk through things like piloting and demonstration projects that kind of understand what works in a fairly confined or controlled manner, rather than kind of going big straight away, which is something to think about. I do think there is a role for government in helping to kind of manage risk to some extent through things like regulation. So we're seeing, for example, heat networks and zoning regulation come through that's helping to create a market and protect consumers, for example. It creates clearer conditions for investment, and it reassures us that there's a framework within which people's concerns will be protected. So I think there's multiple ways in which we can manage risk, but we absolutely will have to take them if we're going to crack this nut. And then again, in terms of who's responsible for bringing people together, I think we all are to some extent. I know, for example, just on that example I referenced there, government are considering things like zoning coordinators for heat networks. That could prove really helpful. We've yet to see the details of that and who specifically will be expected to step into that role, and I'm sure there's going to need to be quite a lot of capacity building that goes with that. But there's definitely a role for government in this space as well, I think.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Sarah?
Yeah, so I think in terms of where we should place risk, it's important to place it where it's most appropriate. So things like, say technology risk, we don't think it's appropriate for non-expert, whether that's local authorities or households, to take on technology risk. So we only offer very, very, low technology risk wind farms and solar parks, because we're constantly being asked, can we do tidal or whatever else? It's like, no, the risk is too great. And things like project development risk, that's a really, really risky thing to do. And so it's appropriate for project developers to take that risk. They're expert in developing projects. So it's about keeping the risk where it's most appropriate and where people can control it themselves the best. In terms of how we get people together to make these things happen, basically Ripple realised that there's this huge need to coordinate people to come together and make these projects happen. So essentially that's what Ripple does, is we gather together thousands of households, companies, we can work with local authorities as well, and they can collectively come together. Everything is proportional. If you own 1% of a project, you get 1% of its power and you pay for 1% of its capital cost. And you pay for 1% of its OPEX. It's all proportional. So it's really important that we have companies like Ripple who can coordinate, because, there are a very dispersed range of people wanting to do the same thing. And so, we can tap into, people spread out across the whole country who want to come together and make these things happen. And we can basically manage the whole thing for them.
Thank you, Sarah. Chris?
There's kind of two things I just wanted to touch on. One is, I think the political culture needs to change. I think we've got to have more of a focus on trying to set that early when there's a new cohort of councillors and politicians that come through. We need to have those honest conversations, because there is no silver bullet, there's no one technology, there's no one intervention that's going to unlock everything, and it's going to be cheap and it's going to deliver all the societal benefits we want. Local authorities can be risk adverse, and they have sometimes those cultures that are ingrained. So you do really need to look at that kind of organisational risk profile and how much we're willing to jump into some of these new areas, and then who is appropriate. I think Sarah sort of touched on the appropriateness of that. I think the question about engaging with local authorities, there are some really great partnerships. They probably take a long time to get off the ground, and I think some of the structures and the systems that we've got in place can be better than what we have. But I would say engage early, engage often, and look at what the council is saying and put out there. What is the political direction that has been set? What are in the corporate strategies? And then go in and try and align if your intervention works, or your product or your technology is going to be beneficial on that win-win-win profile, then absolutely engage with councils. Don't always take the first no, because you might have gone to the wrong person. They are massive monoliths, and sometimes those departments don't always talk to each other. But it is not going to be easy, but keep going. If you think it aligns, then do that. If you're just going in and cold selling something, you're probably going to get a no. You're not going to get very far.
Final note,
Yeah,
Alan?
final note. So I think on the terms of risk, and I'm a big believer in impact investing, and I think this is the promise of impact investing as well, to redefine the relationship between risk and return. So how do we internalize the cost and of other elements that are externalized and people are paying for, that now it has to be taken into account in the system change approach. And this is what I'm going to explain at 2040 in the Energy Hub, demonstrating with the industry of desalination how you can transform this and use that as redefining that relationship. And that's really key. That's what's needed, actually.
Perfect. Okay, so I think it's time to finish our panel. Just finally to say about the collaboration aspect between business and cities, we've created a blueprint as part of a CBCA Climate Business Alliance on how to do that. So it's something that comes up a lot in the work that we have with cities about how to collaborate with the private sector given the different cultures, etc. So we can connect on that later. I'd like to thank everyone here. I'd like to thank all the panelists for, I think, a really, really interesting and diverse discussion that we had today. And enjoy the rest of your day in this event. Thank you.